In the gleaming conference room of Meridian Industries' 42nd floor, Emma Moore was about to face the most devastating betrayal of her corporate career. What started as a routine Monday morning strategy meeting took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her immediate termination and replacement by the CEO's unqualified 23-year-old niece. Emma Moore wasn't your typical corporate executive. For 8 years, she had transformed a struggling startup into a Fortune 500 powerhouse through pure merit and relentless dedication. When she discovered Richard Blackwood's systematic embezzlement scheme hidden behind her firing, she unleashed a calculated campaign of corporate warfare that would expose millions in fraud and reshape the entire company's leadership through strategic board manipulation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor conference room, casting familiar geometric shadows across the polished mahogany table where Emma Moore had orchestrated countless strategic victories. She arrived at 7:30 a.m. sharp, as she had every Monday for the past 8 years, carrying her leather portfolio and the quarterly projections that would secure Meridian Industries' expansion into the Southeast markets. The coffee was already brewing in the adjoining kitchenette, Colombian dark roast, the way she'd trained the facilities team to prepare it for these early morning strategy sessions. Emma had built her reputation in this room. It was here she'd convinced the board to acquire 3 smaller competitors during the recession, transforming Meridian from a struggling mid-tier consultancy into a Fortune 500 powerhouse. Here she'd negotiated the partnerships that now generated 40% of their revenue. The faint scuff marks on the hardwood floor near her usual seat told the story of countless presentations, late-night planning sessions, and the methodical construction of an empire she'd helped Richard Blackwood build from the ground up. She pulled up the market analysis on her tablet, reviewing the data one final time. The Southeast expansion would add an estimated $200 million in annual revenue within 3 years, conservative projections that she knew were actually understated. Emma had learned long ago to underpromise and overdeliver, a philosophy that had earned her Richard's trust and the board's respect. Her working-class upbringing in Cleveland had taught her that survival meant being twice as good as everyone else, and that lesson had served her well in Manhattan's unforgiving corporate landscape. The conference room door opened at exactly 8 o'clock, but instead of Richard's usual energetic entrance, he walked in with measured steps, his face wearing an expression Emma had never seen before, cold, almost clinical detachment. Behind him followed someone Emma didn't recognize, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a designer suit that screamed fresh out of business school rather than battle-tested executive. "Emma," Richard said, settling into his chair at the head of the table without his customary greeting. No good morning, no inquiries about her weekend, no jokes about the Yankees' latest loss. The absence of warmth sent the first prickle of unease down Emma's spine. "I've asked you here this morning because we need to discuss some organizational changes." Richard's voice carried a formal tone she'd never heard him use with her before. They'd worked together for 8 years, had drinks after closing major deals, had even shared personal stories during late-night flights to client meetings. This wasn't the Richard who'd called her his secret weapon just 3 weeks ago during the board meeting. Emma set down her tablet, her analytical mind immediately cataloging the anomalies, Richard's body language, the presence of the unknown woman, the lack of his usual material spread across the table. "What kind of organizational changes?" she asked, keeping her voice level despite the growing tension in her chest. "Effective immediately, I'm making changes to the executive structure." Richard's eyes remained fixed on a point just over Emma's left shoulder, refusing to meet her gaze. "Sophia will be joining us as the new chief operating officer." The words hit Emma like a physical blow, but years of high-stakes negotiations had taught her to control her reactions. She felt her heart rate spike even as she maintained her composure, her hands remaining steady on the table. "I see," she said carefully, her mind racing through the implications. "And my role in this new structure?" The young woman, Sophia, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting between Richard and Emma. Up close, Emma could see the family resemblance, the same weak chin Richard tried to hide behind his carefully groomed beard, the same pale blue eyes that now avoided direct contact. "Your services will no longer be required," Richard said, finally meeting Emma's eyes with what looked almost like defiance. "We're moving in a different direction, and we feel fresh perspectives will better serve the company's future." The clinical language of corporate termination couldn't disguise what was happening. 8 years of 16-hour days, of building relationships, of sacrificing weekends and holidays to grow this company, and Richard was dismissing her with the same emotional investment he'd show in canceling a subscription service. "Fresh perspectives," Emma repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at Sophia, who couldn't have been older than 23, whose most recent accomplishment was probably a summer internship at some family friend's company. From someone with what qualifications, exactly? Sophia has an MBA from Wharton, Richard said defensively, his first crack in the composed facade. She brings innovative thinking and a modern approach to business development. Emma almost laughed at the absurdity. An MBA from Wharton, she had one too, earned while working full-time and taking classes at night, paid for with student loans she'd only finished repaying 3 years ago. But Sophia's had been handed to her by family connections and trust fund payments, probably with a guaranteed job waiting at the end. I see you've thought this through carefully, Emma said, standing slowly and gathering her materials. As she reached for her portfolio, she caught sight of financial documents Richard was hastily sliding beneath a folder, quarterly reports with figures that didn't match the numbers she'd reviewed last week. Red flags immediately went up in her mind. Why was Richard trying to hide routine financial data? Why the sudden urgency to remove her specifically? Your access cards and company devices will be deactivated as of 9 a.m., Richard continued, his discomfort now visible in the way he fidgeted with his Mont Blanc pen. Security will escort you out to ensure a smooth transition. The final humiliation. Not even allowed to clear out her own office, to say goodbye to the team she'd built, to collect the personal items that marked 8 years of her life. Emma felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest, replacing the initial shock with something far more dangerous, clarity. Of course, she said, her voice regaining its strength. Though I have to say, Richard, this seems remarkably sudden. Just last week you were praising the Southeast expansion projections. Now you're concerned about fresh perspectives? She watched his face carefully, noting the slight flush that crept up his neck, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. These were tells she'd learned to read during negotiations, signs of deception or discomfort that had helped her close countless deals. Business priorities change, he said stiffly. I'm sure someone with your qualifications will land on her feet quickly. Emma nodded slowly, her mind already working through the timeline of events, the strange budget meetings she'd been excluded from lately, the way Marcus Thompson had seemed nervous during their last CFO briefing. The pieces weren't fitting together yet, but patterns were emerging, patterns that suggested this decision had nothing to do with fresh perspectives and everything to do with something Richard needed to hide. As if summoned by Richard's mention of security, 2 guards appeared in the doorway. Emma recognized them, Jim and Carlos, men she'd chatted with countless times during late nights at the office. Now they couldn't meet her eyes, professional embarrassment written across their faces. Emma, one of them said gently, we'll need to escort you to your office to collect personal items. She walked between them through the corridors she'd traversed thousands of times, past the framed photos of company milestones where her achievements hung prominently on the walls. Employees who'd worked under her for years watched with confused expressions as she passed, clearly unaware of what had just transpired in the conference room. In her office, Emma quickly gathered the few personal items that mattered, a photo of her parents at her Columbia graduation, the crystal paperweight the board had given her after the Meridian Industries acquisition, her backup hard drive with personal files. As she packed, her mind cataloged everything she knew about Meridian's operations, every relationship she'd built, every weakness in Richard's leadership she'd diplomatically overlooked. The elevator ride down 42 floors felt like a descent through 8 years of her life in reverse. Each floor marked achievements being stripped away, relationships being severed, a carefully constructed identity being dismantled by corporate decree. But by the time the doors opened onto the marble lobby, Emma Moore had undergone a fundamental transformation. She was no longer the loyal lieutenant who dedicated her life to building someone else's empire. She was no longer the team player who'd accepted Richard's quirks and questionable decisions in service of the greater good. The Emma Moore who walked out onto the Manhattan sidewalk was someone new, someone who'd learned in the span of 30 minutes that loyalty was a luxury she could no longer afford. The autumn air bit at her face as she stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the glass tower that had been her second home. 42 floors up, Richard Blackwood was probably congratulating himself on eliminating a potential problem. What he didn't realize was that he'd just created a much bigger one. Emma pulled out her phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in months, James Morrison, her former mentor, now one of the most powerful venture capitalists in the city. If Richard wanted to play corporate games, she'd show him what an expert player looked like. But first, she needed to understand exactly what Richard was hiding. The hastily covered financial documents, the nervous energy, the desperate urgency to remove her specifically, it all pointed to something bigger than a simple personnel change. Emma had built her career on her ability to see patterns others missed, and every instinct she'd honed over 8 years was screaming that Richard's betrayal was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. As she walked away from Meridian Industries for what she assumed would be the last time, Emma began planning her return. Not as an employee, but as something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The autumn air bit at Emma's face as she stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the glass tower that had been her second home. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by something sharper, more focused. She pulled her coat tighter and hailed a taxi, her mind already shifting from victim to investigator. Her Manhattan apartment felt different when she entered 20 minutes later, smaller somehow, as if losing her corporate identity had diminished her physical space as well. The modern furnishings and carefully curated art that had once represented success now seemed like props in someone else's life. Emma set her box of personal items on the granite kitchen counter and opened her laptop, muscle memory guiding her to the secure cloud storage where she kept backup copies of all her work files. The first thing that struck her was how much financial data she actually had access to. 8 years as COO had given her insight into every aspect of Meridian's operations, from quarterly projections to vendor contracts to executive compensation packages. What she was looking for wasn't immediately obvious, but Emma had learned long ago that corporate fraud left fingerprints for those who knew where to look. She started with the budget anomalies she'd noticed in recent months, small discrepancies that individually meant nothing but collectively formed a concerning pattern. The marketing budget had increased by 15% without any corresponding campaigns. Legal expenses had spiked dramatically in the third quarter with no major litigation on the books. Most telling was the consulting fees category, which had ballooned to include payments to firms Emma had never heard of. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Kim. "Emma, I can't believe what happened. Are you okay? Can we talk?" David, her protégé, the ambitious young MBA she'd hired 3 years ago as her executive assistant and mentored into a senior analyst role. If anyone would have insight into the company's current operations, it would be him. She typed back, "Meet me at Café Luna on 47th in an hour. Come alone." While waiting for David, Emma continued her analysis. She pulled up Richard's expense reports, something she'd had legitimate access to as COO for budgeting purposes. The pattern that emerged made her stomach tighten with recognition. Richard's personal expenses had increased dramatically over the past 18 months, luxury hotels charged to client development, expensive dinners categorized as business entertainment, even what appeared to be gambling expenses listed as strategic partnership development. But it was the consulting payments that really caught her attention. Morrison Strategic Solutions, $50,000 monthly retainer for the past year. Blackwood Development Group, $75,000 quarterly payments. The names were generic enough to seem legitimate, but Emma's encyclopedic knowledge of Meridian's actual consultants told her these were fabrications. Her phone rang. "Emma?" David's voice was tight with anxiety. "I'm outside the cafe. This place is packed, should we go somewhere else?" "No, crowded is good. Back corner booth." Emma closed her laptop and headed out, her investigative instincts now fully engaged. David looked older than his 28 years when she found him nursing a coffee, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his tie loosened. The stress of the morning was written across his face, and Emma felt a pang of guilt for involving him in whatever was about to unfold. "I can't believe they just fired you," he said before she'd even sat down. "The whole office is in shock. Nobody understands what's happening." "Tell me about the new COO, Emma said, settling into the booth and keeping her voice low. "What's the internal reaction?" David's expression darkened. "Sophia? It's a disaster. Emma. She doesn't understand basic financial concepts, keeps asking questions that show she has no idea how our business model works. This morning she tried to reorganize the entire operations department based on some textbook theory from business school." Emma nodded, filing away the information. "What about Richard? How has he been behaving lately?" "Weird. Really weird." David leaned forward conspiratorially. "He's been having a lot of closed-door meetings with Marcus Thompson. And last week, he had me prepare budget reports that didn't match the numbers you'd given me for the quarterly review. When I asked about the discrepancies, he told me to use his figures and not ask questions. The pieces were starting to form a picture, and Emma didn't like what she was seeing. David, I need you to be very careful about what I'm going to ask you. Can you access the consulting vendor database?" "Of course, that's part of my regular reporting duties." His eyes widened as he understood the implication. "You think something's wrong with the consulting payments?" "I think a lot of things are wrong." Emma pulled out her phone and showed him a photo she'd taken of her notes. "Do you recognize any of these consulting firms?" David studied the list, his frown deepening. "Morrison Strategic Solutions. I remember that one because I tried to contact them last month to verify some payment details for the quarterly review. The phone number was disconnected, and the address turned out to be a UPS store in New Jersey. Emma felt her pulse quicken. What did you do about it? I brought it to Marcus Thompson's attention. He told me not to worry about it, said it was a confidential strategic engagement that didn't require my involvement. David paused, understanding dawning in his eyes. Oh my God, Emma. You think Richard is stealing from the company? I think Richard is doing a lot of things he shouldn't be doing. Emma kept her voice steady, but internally she was calculating the scope of what appeared to be systematic embezzlement. David, I need you to promise me something. Don't let on that we've talked about this. Can you quietly gather more information about these consulting payments without raising suspicions? I can try, but Emma. David's voice dropped to a whisper. Marcus has been acting really strange too. He looks sick all the time, like he's not sleeping. And yesterday I saw him putting documents through the shredder in his office, which he never does. He always has his assistant handle that stuff. Marcus Thompson, the CFO who'd been with Meridian for 5 years, a methodical man with 2 young children and a reputation for absolute integrity. If Marcus was involved in whatever Richard was doing, it was either willingly or under duress. Emma's instincts told her it was the latter. Marcus's nervous behavior during recent meetings suddenly made perfect sense. One more thing, David said, glancing around nervously. This morning, after you were escorted out, Richard called an emergency meeting with all department heads. He told them that you'd been terminated for philosophical differences about the company's direction, and that anyone caught communicating with you would face disciplinary action. The threat was both predictable and telling. Richard was scared enough to explicitly forbid contact with her, which meant he understood exactly how dangerous her knowledge could be. David, you need to be smart about this, Emma said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Whatever you decide to do, think about your career first. I won't ask you to sacrifice your future for my problems. But they're not just your problems, are they? David's voice carried a maturity she'd never heard before. If Richard is stealing from the company, it affects all of us. Our jobs, our reputations, everything we've built. Emma studied his face, seeing the same analytical mind that had made her hire him 3 years ago. David Kim had grown up in a working-class Korean-American family in Queens, had earned his MBA through merit and determination, just as she had. He understood better than most that corporate corruption didn't just hurt balance sheets, it destroyed the careers of innocent people who'd played by the rules. Then we need to be very, very careful, Emma said. Because if we're right about this, Richard has already shown he's willing to destroy people who threaten him. And if we're wrong? We're not wrong, David said with quiet conviction. I've been watching the numbers for months, Emma. Something's been off, but I didn't want to believe it. Now that I know what to look for. Emma nodded, feeling the familiar rush of a complex problem beginning to reveal its solution. But this wasn't a business challenge or a strategic acquisition, this was personal warfare, with casualties that would extend far beyond the executive suite. As they left the cafe separately, Emma's phone buzzed with another text, this one from an unknown number. Ms. Moore, this is Catherine Sterling from the Financial Tribune. I'd like to discuss some questions about Meridian Industries corporate governance. Would you be available for a conversation? Emma stared at the message, her mind racing. A journalist investigating Meridian's corporate governance, just hours after her termination. The timing was either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence that someone else had noticed the same patterns she was now uncovering. She walked back toward her apartment, the Manhattan skyline stretching endlessly around her, and began planning her next move. Richard Blackwood had made a critical error in firing her. He'd assumed that removing her from the building would neutralize the threat she represented. What he'd actually done was free her from any obligation to protect the company's reputation or maintain corporate loyalty. Now she was going to show him exactly what 8 years of intimate knowledge about Meridian Industries could accomplish in the hands of someone with nothing left to lose. Emma walked back toward her apartment, the Manhattan skyline stretching endlessly around her, Catherine Sterling's message still glowing on her phone screen. A journalist investigating Meridian's corporate governance wasn't a coincidence, it was an opportunity. But first, she needed to build her foundation, starting with the one person whose loyalty had never wavered throughout her career. James Morrison answered on the second ring, his familiar gravelly voice cutting through the traffic noise around her. Emma Moore? I was wondering when I'd hear from you. You heard already? Emma ducked into the relative quiet of a building alcove. Word travels fast in our circles. Richard Blackwood unceremoniously firing his COO isn't exactly a quiet affair. James's tone carried the subtle edge that had made him legendary in venture capital circles, patient, calculating, but with an underlying steel that could slice through corporate pretense. More interesting is the timing. Meridian's board meeting is in 3 weeks. Emma felt her pulse quicken. James always saw the chessboard several moves ahead. You think this is connected to board politics? I think Richard Blackwood is. Many things, but spontaneous isn't one of them. When a CEO fires his most competent executive 3 weeks before facing the board, it's either panic or strategy. Given what I know about Richard's financial habits, I'm betting on panic. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The implication hung in the air between them. James Morrison's investment firm, Morrison Capital, held a significant stake in Meridian Industries, enough to influence board decisions if wielded strategically. More importantly, James had his own history with Richard, a failed partnership 3 years ago that had cost Morrison Capital nearly $10 million when Richard's due diligence proved catastrophically incomplete. I'd like to buy you lunch, Emma said carefully. Catch up on old times. Le Bernardin, 1 o'clock. And Emma? Come prepared to discuss more than just old times. The restaurant's elegant atmosphere provided perfect cover for sensitive conversations, the quiet sophistication ensuring privacy among Manhattan's power brokers. James was already seated when Emma arrived, his silver hair impeccably styled, his navy suit speaking of understated wealth and influence. At 62, he remained one of the most feared negotiators in the city, but his mentor's smile was genuine as she approached. You look remarkably composed for someone who was ceremoniously fired this morning, he said, standing to greet her with a brief embrace. I've had 8 years to prepare for this possibility. Richard's been making increasingly questionable decisions lately. Emma settled into her chair, noting how James's expression sharpened with interest. Tell me about these questionable decisions. Over the next hour, Emma laid out everything she'd discovered, the phantom consulting firms, the inflated expenses, the suspicious budget changes that Marcus Thompson had been reluctantly implementing. James listened without interruption, his practiced poker face revealing nothing, but Emma could see the calculating intelligence working behind his eyes. Embezzlement, he said finally, swirling his wine thoughtfully. Classic pattern, create fake vendors, approve payments to yourself. Hope the CFO is too scared or complicit to ask questions. How much are we talking about? Based on what I've seen so far? Potentially millions over the past 18 months. But James, that's not why I'm here. His eyebrows rose slightly. No? I'm here because I think Richard fired me to prevent me from discovering something even bigger. The timing of my termination, the way he's been restructuring financial oversight, the panic in his behavior, it all suggests something major is coming to light. James set down his wine glass with deliberate precision. And you want to accelerate that timeline? I want justice. For myself, for the company, for everyone. Richard's corruption is going to hurt when it inevitably comes to light. Emma leaned forward slightly. But I can't do it alone. I need allies with influence, with board connections, with the financial leverage to force accountability. You want Morrison Capital to use its voting power to challenge Richard's leadership. I want Morrison Capital to help me save a company we both believe in from a CEO who's systematically destroying it. Emma pulled out her tablet, showing James the preliminary analysis she'd compiled. Look at these numbers, James. Meridian's fundamentals are still strong, the business I helped build is sound. But Richard's corruption is going to sink everything unless we act. James studied the data with the focused intensity that had made him one of the most successful investors of his generation. Dr. Elena Vasquez, he said suddenly. The board member? Former Stanford business professor, served on Meridian's board for 3 years. Absolute integrity, analytically brilliant, and she's been growing increasingly concerned about Richard's leadership style. James's smile turned predatory. I had drinks with her last month. She mentioned documenting certain questionable decisions. For her personal records. Emma felt pieces clicking into place. She's been building a case. Elena Vasquez doesn't do anything without thorough documentation. If she's concerned enough to keep records, she's already identified significant problems. James paused, his expression becoming more serious. But Emma, you need to understand what you're proposing. This isn't just corporate maneuvering, this is warfare. Richard won't go quietly, and he'll try to destroy anyone who threatens him. He already destroyed me. No, he fired you. If you proceed with this, he'll try to destroy your reputation, your relationships, your entire professional future. Are you prepared for that level of conflict? Emma thought about the humiliation of being escorted out of her own building. About Sophia Blackwood's unqualified entitlement, about the employees whose jobs would be at risk if Richard's corruption continued unchecked. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to stop him. James nodded slowly. Then let's arrange for you to meet Elena. But we need to be strategic about this. Board members don't appreciate being approached carelessly, especially about matters this sensitive. Dr. Elena Vasquez agreed to meet Emma 2 days later at the New York Public Library, neutral territory that suggested both discretion and intellectual seriousness. Emma found her in the main reading room, a dignified woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and intelligent dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She was reviewing what appeared to be financial documents when Emma approached. Ms. Moore, Elena said quietly, gesturing to the chair beside her. James Morrison speaks very highly of your analytical capabilities. Dr. Vasquez, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. I've been hoping someone with your inside knowledge would come forward. Elena's voice carried the measured authority of someone accustomed to academic precision. I've been documenting concerning patterns in Richard's decision-making for several months now. She opened a leather portfolio, revealing meticulous notes organized by date and topic. Emma's trained eye immediately recognized the systematic approach of someone building a comprehensive case. Questionable vendor relationships, unexplained budget increases, resistance to normal oversight procedures, Elena continued. Individually, these might be explained as aggressive management style. Collectively, they suggest systematic misconduct. I believe Richard has been embezzling company funds through fake consulting agreements, Emma said directly. I also believe my termination was designed to prevent me from exposing this fraud before the upcoming board meeting. Elena's expression didn't change, but Emma caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested confirmation rather than surprise. Do you have evidence to support these allegations? Emma pulled out her tablet, showing Elena the analysis she'd compiled. For the next 30 minutes, they worked through the data together, Elena's academic rigor combining with Emma's operational knowledge to build an increasingly damning picture of Richard's conduct. This is more extensive than I suspected, Elena said finally. James mentioned you're interested in addressing this situation through proper corporate governance channels. I'm interested in saving Meridian Industries from a CEO who's systematically looting it. Elena studied Emma's face carefully. That's a noble goal, Ms. Moore. But I need to know, is this about justice for the company, or revenge for your termination? The question hung in the air between them, and Emma realized this was the moment that would define everything that followed. Elena Vasquez represented the moral center of what they were contemplating, and her participation would legitimize their efforts in the eyes of other board members. Honestly? 6 hours ago, I would have said justice. Now, after seeing the scope of what Richard's been doing, Emma paused, choosing her words carefully. I think justice and revenge might be the same thing in this case. Elena nodded slowly. Then we need to be very careful about our methods. If we're going to challenge a sitting CEO, we need irrefutable evidence and absolute moral authority. The moment we compromise our ethics, we become no better than Richard himself. As they gathered their materials to leave, Elena placed a hand on Emma's arm. There's something else you should know. Richard's behavior has become increasingly erratic over the past month. He's been calling emergency meetings, changing established procedures, showing signs of significant stress. Whatever timeline you're working with, I suspect events may accelerate beyond our control. Emma walked out of the library with a growing sense that she'd set something irreversible in motion. James Morrison's financial influence, Elena Vasquez's moral authority, and her own intimate knowledge of Meridian's operations, together, they represented a formidable challenge to Richard's leadership. But as she hailed a taxi back to her apartment, Emma couldn't shake Elena's warning about Richard's increasingly erratic behavior. Desperate men made dangerous decisions, and Richard Blackwood was beginning to understand that his carefully constructed world was under threat. The question now was whether Emma could execute her plan before Richard realized who was orchestrating his downfall. That answer came sooner than expected when James Morrison called her at 7 a.m. the following Tuesday, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a chess master executing a long-planned gambit. Board meeting's been moved up, he said without preamble. Richard called an emergency session for this Friday. Apparently, he wants to address organizational restructuring and strategic realignment before the regularly scheduled meeting. Emma sat up in bed, her mind immediately sharp despite the early hour. He's panicking. What's the official reason for the acceleration? Market volatility and competitive pressures requiring immediate board attention. James's dry chuckle conveyed exactly what he thought of that explanation. More likely, someone's applying pressure he didn't expect. The timing suggests he knows about our conversations. Or he's discovered that his embezzlement is about to be exposed. Emma was already moving toward her laptop, her strategic mind engaging fully. James, can Morrison Capital call for board restructuring at an emergency meeting? Under the company bylaws, any shareholder controlling more than 5% can propose governance changes with 72 hours notice. Morrison Capital controls 8%. The predatory satisfaction in his voice was unmistakable. I filed the paperwork yesterday. We're proposing Elena Vasquez for elevation to board vice chair and the creation of a new oversight committee for executive compensation and vendor relationships. Emma felt the first rush of strategic victory, that intoxicating blend of intellectual satisfaction and personal vindication she'd experienced countless times in corporate negotiations. But this time, the stakes were intensely personal. What about Harrison? Board member William Harrison had been Richard's most reliable ally for 3 years, a former banking executive whose loyalty had been purchased through lucrative consulting contracts for his post-retirement firm. Removing Harrison would be essential for gaining control of board dynamics. Harrison received a very interesting call yesterday from the SEC regarding some irregularities in his consulting arrangements with Meridian. Apparently, someone provided them with detailed documentation about potential conflicts of interest. James's tone was innocently conversational. He's decided to step down from the board to focus on resolving these regulatory concerns. Emma paused, recognizing the ruthless efficiency of James's maneuvering. Harrison's removal wasn't just strategic, it was a warning shot across Richard's bow, demonstrating that his allies weren't untouchable. Elena agreed to this acceleration. Elena drafted the ethics guidelines for the new oversight committee. She's quite thorough when properly motivated. By Thursday evening, Emma was reviewing the final details of their coordinated strategy from her apartment. Spread across her dining table were financial analyses, board member profiles, and a timeline of Richard's increasingly suspicious decisions. David Kim had provided crucial intelligence throughout the week: Sophia's continued struggles as COO, Marcus Thompson's visible anxiety during budget meetings, and most importantly, Richard's growing paranoia about information security. He's been having IT audit all email access logs, David had reported during their carefully orchestrated encounter at a coffee shop near his apartment. And yesterday he asked me to prepare a presentation about potential corporate espionage threats. Emma, I think he knows someone's investigating him. The knowledge that Richard suspected organized opposition only confirmed Emma's assessment. They needed to strike decisively before he could mount an effective defense. Corporate warfare required overwhelming force applied at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. Elena confirms board meeting logistics. Richard scheduled executive session first, no outside counsel present. Perfect for our purposes. Emma's strategic mind cataloged the implications. An executive session meant Richard was planning to present sensitive information without legal oversight, likely hoping to rush through decisions before opposition could organize. What he didn't know was that his opposition was already organized and prepared to turn his own tactics against him. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, Manhattan's autumn weather matching Emma's mood as she prepared for what would either be vindication or professional destruction. She dressed carefully in her navy Armani suit, armor for corporate battle, and reviewed her talking points one final time. At 9:15 a.m., her phone rang with a call that would change everything. Emma, it's Catherine Sterling from the Financial Tribune. I know you're busy, but I need 5 minutes of your time. The journalist. Emma had been expecting this call since Tuesday, when Sterling's investigation into Meridian's corporate governance had apparently accelerated alongside their own timeline. Ms. Sterling, I'm not sure I'm the right person to. You're exactly the right person, Catherine interrupted with the confidence of someone who'd done her homework. I've been investigating irregularities in Meridian Industries vendor payments for 6 weeks. Your termination on Monday was the final piece I needed to understand the scope of what's happening. Emma felt her pulse quicken. An independent investigation by a respected financial journalist could either validate their board challenge or destroy it, depending on Sterling's conclusions and timing. I'm not sure what you think I can tell you. I think you can tell me whether Richard Blackwood fired you to prevent you from exposing systematic embezzlement through fabricated consulting agreements. Sterling's voice carried the direct authority of someone accustomed to cutting through corporate evasion. And I think you can tell me whether certain board members are planning to address the situation at today's emergency meeting. The journalist knew everything. Either through independent investigation or sources within Meridian, Sterling had uncovered their entire strategy. Emma made a split-second decision that would define everything that followed. Ms. Sterling, if you're investigating corporate fraud at Meridian Industries, I'd be happy to provide factual information about financial irregularities I observed during my tenure as COO. Excellent. Can you meet me at 11 a.m.? I'd like to run my findings past you before I submit my article for publication. Emma agreed to meet at a small restaurant near her apartment, then immediately called James to warn him about this new variable. His response was characteristically pragmatic: either Sterling's article helps our case or it forces Richard into even more desperate measures. Either way, it accelerates our timeline. At the Meridian Industries board meeting, Richard Blackwood was discovering exactly how desperate his measures would need to become. The emergency session he'd called to consolidate his position was instead becoming his undoing, as James Morrison's procedural motion to restructure board leadership gained unexpected support from 3 previously neutral members. I think the board would benefit from Dr. Vasquez's academic perspective in a more formal leadership role, announced board member Patricia Wells, whose vote Richard had considered secure. The proposed oversight committee also addresses several concerns I've had about transparency in our vendor relationships. Richard's face flushed as he realized the scope of the coordinated challenge to his authority. Elena Vasquez's elevation to board vice chair passed by a vote of 6-3, fundamentally shifting the power dynamics he'd spent years carefully cultivating. But the real blow came when Elena, now armed with formal authority, requested a comprehensive review of all consulting agreements exceeding $25,000 over the past 18 months. The motion passed 7-2, with even some of Richard's traditional allies recognizing the political necessity of supporting transparency measures. I'd like Marcus Thompson to present detailed financial documentation for these agreements. At our next meeting, Elena continued with academic precision, including verification of services rendered and confirmation of vendor legitimacy. Richard's response revealed the desperation Emma had predicted. I think the board is overstepping its oversight role. These operational details should remain within executive purview. The pushback was a critical error, confirming for wavering board members that Richard had something to hide. James Morrison seized the opening with surgical precision. Given the CEO's resistance to standard financial oversight, I move that the board retain independent auditors to review all executive-approved expenditures over the past 2 years. The motion passed 8-1, with only Richard voting against it. Meanwhile, Emma was learning from Catherine Sterling that the journalist's investigation had uncovered even more extensive fraud than she'd suspected. Conservative estimate puts the embezzlement at $3.2 million over 20 months, Sterling said, spreading financial documents across their restaurant table. But the pattern suggests acceleration. Richard's been increasing both the frequency and size of fraudulent payments. Gambling debts, Emma said, pieces clicking into place. I noticed patterns in his expense reports that suggested increasing desperation. Atlantic City, Las Vegas, private poker games in Manhattan. My sources suggest he's into underground gambling for amounts that would terrify most CEOs. Sterling made notes as she spoke. The question is whether this is addiction or if someone's applying pressure. Emma stared at the journalist, understanding flooding through her. You think Richard's being extorted? I think a CEO who's embezzling millions to pay gambling debts might be vulnerable to people who don't accept corporate payment plans. Sterling's expression was grimly professional. Which means this situation is potentially more dangerous than simple corporate fraud. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma's phone buzzed with an urgent text from David Kim, emergency. Richard just called security meeting about corporate espionage. Asked specifically about your access to financial systems. You need to be careful. Emma showed the message to Sterling, who nodded grimly. My article publishes Monday morning. That gives us 3 days before this becomes public knowledge. Us? Emma asked. You've been fighting for justice. I've been fighting for truth. Sometimes those are the same thing. Sterling gathered her materials with practiced efficiency. But Emma, you need to understand, once my article publishes, Richard Blackwood becomes a man with nothing left to lose. People in that position make dangerous decisions. As Emma walked back to her apartment, she felt the intoxicating rush of strategic victory tempered by a growing awareness of personal risk. They'd won the first major battle, fundamentally shifting board dynamics in their favor. But Richard's increasingly erratic behavior suggested the war was far from over. Her phone rang as she reached her building. James Morrison, calling with an update that would prove prophetic. Richard's hired a private investigation firm. Corporate security is one thing, but this suggests he's planning to fight back on a personal level. Emma, you need to be prepared for this to get ugly. Standing in her apartment lobby, Emma realized that her quest for justice had evolved into something more complex and dangerous than she'd originally envisioned. But there was no turning back now. Too much momentum, too many people depending on her, too much at stake to abandon the fight. Richard Blackwood had made the mistake of underestimating her once. She wouldn't give him the opportunity to do it again. Richard Blackwood had made the mistake of underestimating her once. She wouldn't give him the opportunity to do it again. But as Emma discovered over the following week, Richard's counterattack would target the people she cared about most, forcing her to confront the true cost of corporate warfare. The first casualty was Marcus Thompson. David Kim called her Tuesday morning, his voice tight with anxiety. "Emma, something's happened to Marcus." Richard called him into a private meeting yesterday afternoon, and when he came out, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Then this morning, he didn't show up for the monthly budget review. Marcus never misses meetings. Emma felt ice form in her stomach. Marcus Thompson was the linchpin of their entire strategy. His financial expertise and access to accounting records were essential for building an irrefutable case against Richard. More importantly, Marcus was a fundamentally decent man caught in an impossible situation, trying to protect his family while wrestling with his conscience. "Have you tried contacting him directly?" "I called his office, his cell, even his home number. Nothing. His assistant says he called in sick, but..." "Emma." David paused, lowering his voice. "I saw him in the parking garage yesterday after his meeting with Richard. He was sitting in his car, just staring straight ahead. He looked terrified." Emma closed her eyes, recognizing the tactical brilliance of Richard's move. Threatening Marcus's job security was one thing, threatening his children's future was another. A single father with 2 kids in private school, Marcus couldn't afford to lose his position, and Richard undoubtedly understood that vulnerability better than anyone. "David, I need you to be very careful now. If Richard is willing to pressure Marcus, he won't hesitate to target you." "Too late for that." David's laugh carried no humor. "Yesterday afternoon, I got transferred out of strategic analysis to corporate communications. My new supervisor informed me that I'll be handling internal newsletters and employee announcements. It's basically corporate exile." The systematic dismantling of her support network was exactly what Emma should have anticipated, but the personal cost still hit her like a physical blow. David Kim had risked his career to help her, and now he was paying the price for his loyalty. "David, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." His voice carried a determination that reminded Emma of herself at his age. "This isn't just about you anymore, Emma. Richard's corruption affects everyone at Meridian. If we don't stop him now, he'll destroy the company and blame it on market forces." That afternoon, Emma met Catherine Sterling at a discreet wine bar in the village, away from the midtown locations where they might encounter Meridian employees or board members. The journalist looked unusually tense, her typical professional composure replaced by something approaching concern. "We have a problem," Catherine said without preamble. "I've been getting pressure from my editor to delay publication of the Meridian story." Emma felt her carefully constructed timeline beginning to collapse. What kind of pressure? The kind that comes with phone calls from expensive law firms threatening defamation suits and demanding proof of every allegation. Catherine pulled out her tablet, showing Emma legal documents that had apparently arrived that morning. Richards hired Cromwell and Associates. They specialize in aggressive litigation against journalists. Emma recognized the firm's reputation immediately. Cromwell and Associates didn't just threaten lawsuits, they destroyed careers, tied up publications in years of expensive litigation, and made examples of reporters who challenged their clients. Richard was escalating far beyond typical corporate damage control. More concerning, Catherine continued, "Someone's been asking questions about my sources. Yesterday, a man claiming to be from a fact-checking service called my editor, specifically asking about my access to Meridian's internal documents. Professional investigators, Emma. Richard's trying to identify who's feeding me information." The implications were chilling. If Richard's private investigators traced Catherine's sources back to David Kim or Marcus Thompson, both men could face criminal charges for corporate espionage. Emma was beginning to understand that her quest for justice had endangered everyone who'd chosen to help her. "There's something else," Catherine said quietly. "I received an interesting call this morning from Sophia Blackwood. Richard's niece wants to meet with me." Emma's strategic mind immediately engaged. "About what?" "She says she has concerns about her uncle's leadership and wants to discuss the company's direction confidentially." Catherine's expression was carefully neutral. It could be a trap, or it could be that she's having second thoughts about her role in all this. The possibility that Sophia might break with her uncle was intriguing but dangerous. Either the young woman was genuinely developing a conscience, or Richard was using her as bait to identify and neutralize his opposition. "I think you should take the meeting," Emma said after careful consideration. "But assume everything she says is being reported back to Richard." Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Thompson was sitting in his accountant's office, staring at financial projections that confirmed his worst fears. Losing his job at Meridian would mean pulling his children out of private school, selling the house he'd bought after his wife's death, potentially destroying the stable life he'd worked so hard to build as a single parent. The severance package Richard offered would cover maybe 6 months of expenses, his accountant was saying. After that, without another executive-level position. Marcus nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. The choice Richard had presented was brutally simple: remain silent about the embezzlement and keep his job, or speak up and watch his family's security evaporate. But the ethical implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Every day he stayed silent, Richard stole more money from the company, and more innocent employees became unwitting accomplices to fraud. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Thompson, this is Elena Vasquez. I understand you're facing a difficult situation. Would you be willing to discuss your options confidentially? Sometimes there are alternatives we don't see when we're under pressure." Marcus stared at the message, recognizing it as either salvation or another form of manipulation. But Elena Vasquez's reputation for integrity was unquestioned, and her position on the board might provide protection that individual resistance couldn't offer. He typed back, "Dr. Vasquez, I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you." That evening, Emma received a call that would change everything. James Morrison's voice carried an urgency she'd never heard before. "Emma, we have a serious problem. Richard's investigators aren't just looking into your activities, they're conducting a full background investigation. Financial records, personal relationships, professional history. This has moved beyond corporate politics into personal warfare." Emma felt her apartment suddenly seem smaller, less secure. What exactly are they looking for? Anything they can use to discredit you or intimidate you into backing down. But Emma, there's something else. I just received a call from a contact at the SEC. Someone filed a complaint alleging that Morrison Capital is engaging in stock manipulation through coordinated board challenges. The accusation was both brilliant and devastating. If the SEC launched an investigation into Morrison Capital's activities, James would be forced to withdraw from the Meridian situation entirely, leaving Emma without her most powerful ally. "Richard?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. "Almost. Certainly. The complaint includes details about our board strategy that only someone with inside knowledge could provide." James paused, and Emma could hear the calculation in his silence. "Emma, I want you to understand what's happening here. Richard isn't just fighting for his job anymore, he's fighting for his freedom. If our allegations about embezzlement are proven, he's looking at federal prison time. That makes him extremely dangerous." As if summoned by James's warning, Emma's building's doorman called up to announce a visitor. "Ms. Moore, there's a gentleman here from a private investigation firm. Says he has some questions about your employment history." Emma's blood went cold. Richard's investigators had moved from background research to direct intimidation, bringing the conflict literally to her doorstep. "Tell him I'm not available," she instructed the doorman, then turned back to her phone. "James, this is escalating beyond what we anticipated." "Yes, it is. The question now is whether we escalate in response or try to de-escalate before someone gets seriously hurt." James's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen corporate warfare turn personal before. "Emma, I need you to think very carefully about whether revenge is worth the price you, and everyone helping you, might have to pay." As Emma hung up the phone, she realized that her quest for justice had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Richard Blackwood wasn't just a corrupt CEO anymore, he was a desperate man with significant resources and nothing left to lose. The war she'd started was no longer just about corporate governance or financial fraud. It had become personal, with casualties mounting on both sides and no clear path to victory that didn't involve destroying innocent people. Standing at her apartment window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline where Richard's investigators were probably still waiting, Emma faced the first moment of genuine doubt about her chosen path. Justice was supposed to be clean, righteous, morally unambiguous. But the reality of corporate warfare was messier, more complex, and infinitely more dangerous than she'd anticipated. The question now was whether she had the strength, and the moral authority, to see it through to the end. The question now was whether she had the strength, and the moral authority, to see it through to the end. Emma's answer came at 2:47 a.m. when her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Thompson that would transform everything. "Emma, I can't do this anymore. I have the evidence you need. Can we meet tomorrow morning? I know what I have to do." Emma stared at the message in the darkness of her bedroom, understanding immediately that Marcus had reached his breaking point. The pressure Richard had applied, threatening his children's future, his financial security, his entire carefully constructed life, had finally pushed the ethical CFO past his limit of complicity. She texted back, Bryant Park, 7 a.m. East Side. Near the fountain. By dawn, Emma was positioned on a park bench with a clear view of the fountain, her breath visible in the crisp October air. Marcus appeared exactly on time, but the man who approached her looked like he'd aged years in the past week. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his eyes carrying the haunted look of someone who'd been wrestling with his conscience and losing sleep over impossible choices. Emma, he said quietly, settling beside her on the bench. I need you to understand something before I give you this. He pulled a flash drive from his jacket pocket. Once I hand this over, there's no going back for either of us. Richard will know exactly who provided the evidence, and he'll try to destroy me. Emma studied Marcus's face, seeing the fear but also the resolution of a man who'd made peace with his decision. What changed your mind? My daughter asked me yesterday why I've been so stressed lately. Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. I realized I couldn't look at her and pretend that staying silent was protecting her. If Richard's corruption brings down Meridian, everyone loses their jobs anyway. At least this way, maybe we can save the company. The flash drive felt heavier than its physical weight when Marcus pressed it into Emma's palm. Complete financial records for the past 2 years. Every fraudulent consulting payment, every fabricated vendor, every piece of documentation that proves systematic embezzlement. I've been copying files for weeks, building a comprehensive case. Emma pocketed the drive, feeling the weight of Marcus's sacrifice. Marcus, you know Richard will retaliate. He already has. Yesterday afternoon, he called me into his office and made it very clear that my continued employment depends on my silence about operational irregularities. Marcus's laugh was bitter. He actually used those words, operational irregularities. Like systematic theft is just a minor accounting discrepancy. What did you tell him? That I understood my position perfectly. Marcus stood, straightening his coat with hands that shook slightly. Emma, there's something else you need to know. Richard's been liquidating assets, personal assets, not company funds. His house in the Hamptons went on the market last week. He's preparing to run. The revelation hit Emma like cold water. If Richard was liquidating personal assets, he wasn't just fighting to keep his job, he was preparing for the possibility of criminal prosecution. A CEO ready to flee was infinitely more dangerous than one simply protecting his corporate position. How long do we have? Days, maybe a week. Once he realizes I've copied the financial records. Marcus didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Emma spent the morning analyzing Marcus's evidence, and what she discovered exceeded even her worst suspicions. The embezzlement wasn't just systematic, it was accelerating. Richard's fraudulent payments had increased from $50,000 monthly 18 months ago to over $200,000 in recent months, suggesting either growing desperation or external pressure demanding larger amounts. More concerning were the international wire transfers Marcus had documented. Money wasn't just disappearing into Richard's personal accounts, significant amounts were being sent to offshore entities with names that suggested money laundering rather than legitimate business expenses. At noon, she called Elena Vasquez with an update that would prove pivotal. Dr. Vasquez, we have the evidence we need to remove Richard immediately. But the scope of what we've uncovered suggests this needs to involve federal authorities. How comprehensive is the documentation? Complete financial proof of $3.8 million in embezzlement over 24 months, plus evidence of money laundering through offshore accounts. Emma paused, choosing her words carefully. Elena, this isn't just corporate fraud anymore. The international transfers suggest organized crime connections. Elena's silence stretched long enough that Emma wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Emma, I need you to meet me this afternoon. We're no longer dealing with corporate governance, we're dealing with potential federal crimes that could destroy everyone associated with Meridian if not handled properly. That afternoon's meeting at Elena's Columbia University office felt like a war council. Elena had arranged for James Morrison to join them, and the three of them spread Marcus's evidence across her desk like generals planning a final assault. The board meeting is tomorrow, James said, studying financial documents with practiced precision. We can present this evidence and force Richard's immediate resignation, but once we do, everything becomes public knowledge. Which means every employee, every client, every investor learns that Meridian's CEO has been systematically stealing from the company, Elena added grimly. The reputational damage could be catastrophic. Emma felt the weight of unintended consequences pressing down on her. Her quest for personal justice had uncovered crimes that threatened to destroy the very company she'd devoted 8 years to building. What's the alternative? We contact federal authorities first, Elena suggested. Let the FBI handle the criminal investigation while we manage the corporate transition privately. That could take months, James objected. And, in the meantime, Richard continues stealing money and potentially destroying evidence. Emma's phone buzzed with a text from David Kim, emergency. Richard just sent company-wide memo about malicious rumors and corporate espionage. He's going on the offensive. She showed the message to the others, and Elena's expression darkened. He's trying to control the narrative before we can present evidence to the board. More than that, James said grimly. He's preparing his employees for a siege mentality. If Richard can convince the staff that outside forces are attacking the company, he positions himself as their protector rather than their betrayer. Emma realized with crystalline clarity that they'd reached the point of no return. Richard's escalating desperation, combined with the scope of his crimes, meant that half measures would only give him time to destroy evidence and flee with whatever money he hadn't already stolen. We present everything to the board tomorrow, she decided. Full disclosure, complete evidence, immediate removal. Whatever the consequences for Meridian's reputation, they'll be worse if we let Richard continue. Elena nodded slowly. Then we need to be prepared for total corporate warfare. Richard won't just resign quietly, he'll try to take everyone down with him. That evening, Emma received a call that confirmed Elena's prediction. Catherine Sterling's voice was tight with professional concern. Emma, I just finished my interview with Sophia Blackwood. You need to know, she's not the naive pawn we thought she was. What do you mean? She's been documenting her uncle's behavior since her first week on the job. She knows about the embezzlement, knows about the money laundering, knows about everything. And she's terrified. Emma felt pieces clicking into place. She's been building her own case. More than that. She's been preparing to testify against her uncle if necessary. But Emma, she also told me something that changes everything. Richard's been receiving threats. Someone's been demanding larger payments, and when he couldn't deliver, they started threatening his family. The revelation recontextualized everything Emma thought she understood about Richard's motivations. If he was being extorted by criminals, his desperation wasn't just about maintaining his lifestyle, it was about protecting his life. Who's threatening him? Sophia doesn't know specifics, but the amounts they're demanding match the acceleration in his embezzlement. Emma, if Richard is being extorted by people willing to threaten violence, then everyone involved in exposing him becomes a target. As Emma hung up the phone, she realized that her quest for justice had evolved into something far more dangerous than corporate fraud. She was now involved in a criminal conspiracy that extended beyond Meridian Industries into territories where business disputes were settled through intimidation and violence. Standing in her apartment, surrounded by evidence of Richard's crimes and aware that his criminal associates might now consider her a threat, Emma faced the ultimate test of her commitment to justice. Tomorrow's board meeting would either vindicate her quest for accountability or expose her to dangers she'd never imagined. But there was no turning back now. Too many people had sacrificed too much, and too many crimes had been uncovered to abandon the fight out of fear for personal safety. Richard Blackwood had made his choices. Now Emma would make hers, regardless of the consequences. Richard Blackwood had made his choices. Now Emma would make hers, regardless of the consequences. But as she prepared for the final confrontation, the morning brought revelations that would test the limits of her resolve and force her to confront the true cost of her campaign for justice. At 6:15 a.m., her phone rang with a call from David Kim that shattered any illusion that this would be a clean corporate battle. Emma, they broke into my apartment last night. David's voice was shaky, the usual confidence replaced by barely controlled fear. Professional job, nothing stolen. But they went through everything. My computer, my files, even my personal documents. They left a message. Emma felt ice form in her stomach. What kind of message? A photo of my sister walking to work yesterday morning. She lives in Seattle, Emma. How did they even know about her? David's breathing was audible over the phone. There was a note: corporate espionage has consequences for entire families. The threat was unmistakable and terrifying in its implications. Richard's criminal associates weren't just intimidating the primary players, they were targeting family members to ensure compliance. Emma realized with sickening clarity that her quest for justice had exposed innocent people to genuine danger. David, you need to contact your sister immediately. Tell her to vary her routine, maybe stay with friends for a few days. Already done. But Emma, if they know about my sister in Seattle, what do they know about everyone else? Marcus has 2 kids, Elena has grandchildren. David's voice trailed off as the scope of potential threats became apparent. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility for every person she'd drawn into this conflict. The corporate coup she'd envisioned as a clean battle for justice had become something far messier and more dangerous. David, if you want to walk away now, I'll understand completely. No. His voice carried a determination that surprised her. If we back down now, Richard and whoever's backing him will know they can intimidate anyone into silence. This stops here, or it never stops. At 8 a.m., Emma met Elena Vasquez and James Morrison in Elena's office for what they all understood would be their final strategy session. The atmosphere was grimmer than their previous meetings, the weight of personal threats having transformed their corporate maneuvering into something approaching warfare. I received an interesting call last night, Elena said without preamble. Someone claiming to be from the New York State Ethics Commission, asking detailed questions about my board service and potential conflicts of interest. Professional investigators again. James nodded grimly. Morrison Capital's offices were visited yesterday by men claiming to be from the IRS, demanding immediate access to our Meridian-related investment records. When our legal team asked for proper documentation, they left without explanation. The systematic intimidation campaign revealed both Richard's desperation and his access to resources that extended far beyond typical corporate influence. Emma was beginning to understand that her enemy wasn't just a corrupt CEO, it was a network of criminal interests that viewed corporate fraud as just another business opportunity. Elena, if you want to reconsider your participation in today's board meeting, absolutely not. Elena's voice carried the steel that had made her legendary in academic circles. I've spent 40 years building a reputation based on integrity. I won't compromise that now because criminals think they can intimidate me. James pulled out his tablet, showing them intelligence his security consultants had gathered overnight. Richard's not just liquidating personal assets, he's been moving money to accounts in non-extradition countries. Switzerland, Singapore, the Cayman Islands. If today's board meeting goes badly for him, he's prepared to disappear entirely. The revelation confirmed Emma's worst fears. They weren't just fighting to remove a corrupt CEO, they were racing against time to prevent a criminal from escaping justice entirely. How long do we have? His private jet filed a flight plan for Switzerland departing tomorrow evening, James said quietly. Whatever happens at today's board meeting, Richard's planning to be out of the country within 24 hours. Meanwhile, across town, Catherine Sterling was conducting the most dangerous interview of her career. Sophia Blackwood had agreed to meet at a small cafe in Brooklyn, far from Manhattan's corporate corridors, but the young woman who sat across from Catherine looked nothing like the entitled nepotism beneficiary Emma had described. I know what my uncle is, Sophia said quietly, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup for warmth despite the heated cafe. I've known since my second week on the job, when I tried to understand our consulting relationships and realized half of them don't exist. Catherine studied Sophia's face, seeing genuine anguish rather than calculated manipulation. Why didn't you report it immediately? Because I was 23 years old, had no real-world experience, and my uncle convinced me that I was misunderstanding complex business relationships. Sophia's laugh carried no humor. He's very good at making people doubt their own perceptions. But you've been documenting everything. I started keeping records when I realized the scope of what was happening. Every fraudulent payment, every suspicious transaction, every time he asked me to sign documents I didn't understand. Sophia pulled out a flash drive that matched the one Marcus had given Emma. I thought maybe if I gathered enough evidence, I could convince him to stop. Catherine felt pieces clicking into place. But instead, the crimes escalated. The threats started 3 months ago. Men would call the office asking for my uncle, leaving messages that were clearly not business-related. Then last month, he started talking about corporate enemies and industrial espionage. I realized he wasn't just stealing money, he was being forced to steal more money. The confirmation that Richard was being extorted added layers of complexity to an already dangerous situation. Sophia, why are you telling me this now? Because tomorrow he's planning to disappear, and he wants me to come with him. Sophia's voice broke slightly. He says the people threatening him will target family members if he runs alone. He's given me 12 hours to decide whether to abandon my entire life to protect his crimes. Catherine realized with professional instincts honed over 15 years that she was sitting across from the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. Sophia, would you be willing to testify about what you've witnessed? I'll do whatever it takes to stop this. But Ms. Sterling, you need to understand, if my testimony helps expose the people threatening my uncle, my life is effectively over. These aren't corporate competitors we're dealing with. These are people who use violence to solve business problems. At 3 p.m., Emma received the call that would crystallize her final decision. Marcus Thompson's voice was steady but carried an undertone of resolved fatalism. Emma, they came to my children's school this morning. Men in expensive suits, claiming to be from a new security consulting firm hired by the district. They took photographs of the playground, asked detailed questions about dismissal procedures, made sure the staff understood they'd be monitoring the situation closely. The threat against Marcus's children was both the most personal and most effective weapon Richard's associates could have chosen. No parent would risk their children's safety for abstract principles of corporate justice. "Marcus, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." His voice carried the same determination Emma had heard from David and Elena. "Emma, if we let these people intimidate us into silence, what message does that send to my children about standing up for what's right? I'd rather they grow up knowing their father fought corruption than knowing he surrendered to it." Emma felt something shift inside her as she realized that the choice was no longer hers alone. David Kim, Elena Vasquez, Marcus Thompson, even Sophia Blackwood, all of them had made the decision to see this through despite the personal risks. The board meeting was scheduled for 4 p.m. In 1 hour, they would present evidence of systematic embezzlement, money laundering, and criminal extortion to Meridian's board of directors. The outcome would either vindicate their quest for justice or expose them all to retaliation from criminals who viewed intimidation and violence as standard business practices. As Emma prepared for the confrontation that would define everything that followed, she understood with crystalline clarity that she was no longer fighting just for personal vindication or corporate accountability. She was fighting for the principle that criminal behavior, no matter how sophisticated or well-connected, could not be allowed to triumph over justice simply because good people were afraid to take risks. The woman who walked into Meridian Industries that afternoon was no longer the loyal executive who'd been betrayed and fired. She was someone harder, more determined, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who mistook her principles for weakness. Richard Blackwood was about to discover exactly what 8 years of loyalty could become when transformed into strategic opposition. Richard Blackwood was about to discover exactly what 8 years of loyalty could become when transformed into strategic opposition. The Meridian Industries boardroom had never felt more like a battlefield than it did at 4 p.m. on that gray October afternoon, with 13 years of corporate history about to be decided by the next 2 hours of testimony and evidence. Emma arrived at the building 30 minutes early, using her guest access credentials, a small humiliation that James Morrison had arranged through his board connections. Walking through the lobby where she'd once belonged, escorted by security, to the elevator she'd ridden thousands of times, she felt the strange disconnection of returning to a life that no longer included her. The 42nd floor conference room looked exactly the same as it had 3 weeks ago when Richard had destroyed her career, but the power dynamics were fundamentally different now. Elena Vasquez sat at the head of the table in her new role as board vice chair, her academic composure masking the steel that had made her legendary in business circles. James Morrison occupied his usual seat, but his presence carried new weight as the architect of Richard's downfall. The other board members, 8 in total after Harrison's convenient resignation, wore expressions ranging from concern to openly hostile. Richard himself looked like a man under siege. His usually impeccable appearance showed signs of strain, his suit was wrinkled, his trademark confidence replaced by barely controlled desperation, and his eyes carried the hunted look of someone who understood that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "Before we begin," Elena announced with academic precision, "I want to acknowledge that today's proceedings involve serious allegations about corporate governance and financial impropriety. Given the gravity of these matters, I've arranged for legal counsel to observe our deliberations." 2 attorneys sat quietly in the corner, not Richard's usual corporate lawyers, but federal prosecutors who'd been briefed on the evidence Emma and her allies had compiled. Their presence sent an unmistakable message: this wasn't just a board meeting anymore. It was the beginning of a criminal investigation. Emma took her seat at the presenter's position, opening her laptop and connecting to the room's display system with movements that felt both familiar and surreal. She'd given hundreds of presentations in this room, but never one that would determine whether a sitting CEO went to federal prison. "Members of the board," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal, "over the past 3 weeks, I've uncovered evidence of systematic financial fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering orchestrated by CEO Richard Blackwood. The evidence I'm presenting today represents collaboration between multiple sources, including current and former Meridian employees who've risked their careers to expose these crimes." The first slide displayed the summary Marcus Thompson had prepared: $3.8 million in fraudulent consulting payments over 24 months, routed through fabricated vendor relationships to offshore accounts controlled by Richard. The numbers were stark, undeniable, and devastating. Richard's response was immediate and predictable: "This is a coordinated attack by a disgruntled former employee who's enlisted accomplices to fabricate evidence against me. Emma Moore was terminated for cause, and this presentation represents exactly the kind of vindictive behavior that justified her dismissal." But Emma had anticipated his defense. The second slide showed documentation that even Richard's lawyers would struggle to discredit: bank records, wire transfer confirmations, and corporate resolutions bearing Richard's own signature authorizing payments to companies that existed only on paper. Mr. Blackwood, Elena interjected with academic authority, these documents appear to bear your electronic signature and were processed through Meridian's standard financial systems. Are you suggesting that Ms. Moore somehow fabricated official corporate records? The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Either Richard admitted to authorizing the fraudulent payments, or he claimed that Meridian's financial systems had been compromised, which would require immediate federal investigation regardless. Richard's desperation became visible as he realized the scope of the evidence arrayed against him. These numbers are taken out of context. The consulting relationships in question involve confidential strategic initiatives that the board doesn't have clearance to review. James Morrison leaned forward with the predatory satisfaction of a veteran dealmaker closing a fatal negotiation. Richard, I've been involved in strategic consulting for 30 years. No legitimate engagement involves payments to companies with no employees, no office addresses, and no demonstrable expertise in any field relevant to Meridian's business. Emma advanced to her most devastating evidence, Marcus Thompson's forensic analysis showing how the embezzled money was immediately transferred to personal accounts and then routed to offshore entities. The paper trail was meticulous, undeniable, and utterly damning. The pattern is consistent with money laundering rather than business expenses, Emma explained to the increasingly horrified board members. But more concerning is the acceleration of these payments over recent months, suggesting external pressure demanding larger amounts. It was then that Sophia Blackwood spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. The external pressure comes from people who've been threatening our family for months. The room fell silent as Richard's niece, his supposed ally and beneficiary, became his most devastating witness. Uncle Richard, Sophia continued, her composure cracking slightly, I've been documenting everything since my second week on the job. The fake consulting companies, the offshore transfers, the phone calls from people demanding money. I know about the gambling debts, I know about the threats, and I know about your plan to flee the country tomorrow. Richard's face went white as he realized that his last line of defense had not only abandoned him but was actively testifying against him. Sophia, you don't understand the complexities of, I understand that you've been stealing money from this company to pay criminals, and when that wasn't enough, you started laundering money for them. Sophia's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I understand that you fired Emma Moore because she was getting too close to discovering your crimes. And I understand that you've been planning to abandon Meridian entirely rather than face the consequences of what you've done. The revelation that Richard was involved in money laundering for criminal organizations transformed the proceedings from corporate fraud to organized crime. Emma watched the board members' expressions shift from concern to horror as they realized the scope of Meridian's involvement in criminal activity. Elena Vasquez addressed the federal prosecutors directly. Given the evidence presented today, I believe this matter requires immediate federal intervention. But Richard's response revealed the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. If you proceed with this investigation, every person in this room becomes a target. The people I've been dealing with don't distinguish between those who enable them and those who expose them. You think you're protecting Meridian, but you're destroying everyone associated with it. The threat was both confession and warning, confirming that Richard's criminal associates would view the board's actions as a declaration of war. Emma felt the moment crystallize around a choice that would define everything that followed. They could allow Richard to disappear with whatever money he hadn't already stolen, preserving everyone's safety but ensuring that crime had triumphed over justice. Or they could proceed with full exposure, knowing that it would place everyone involved at risk, from criminals who solved business problems through violence. Mr. Blackwood, Emma said with absolute clarity, 8 years ago, you hired me because you said you valued integrity and dedication. Today, I'm demonstrating exactly those qualities by ensuring that your crimes don't go unpunished, regardless of the personal cost. She turned to the board with the same determination that had built her career. I move that Richard Blackwood be immediately removed as CEO of Meridian Industries and that all evidence of his criminal activity be turned over to federal authorities for prosecution. The vote was unanimous, 8-0, with Richard abstaining. As federal agents entered the conference room to place Richard Blackwood under arrest, Emma realized that her quest for justice had succeeded, but at a cost that was only beginning to become apparent. As federal agents entered the conference room to place Richard Blackwood under arrest, Emma realized that her quest for justice had succeeded, but at a cost that was only beginning to become apparent. The handcuffs clicking around Richard's wrists should have felt like vindication, but instead brought a hollow satisfaction that surprised her with its emptiness. Emma Moore, Agent Sarah Chen addressed her as Richard was led away. "We'll need you to remain available for questioning. Your cooperation will be essential for building the federal case." The next 72 hours blurred together in a sequence of FBI interviews, legal consultations, and media coverage that transformed Meridian Industries from a respected Fortune 500 company into a cautionary tale about corporate corruption. Catherine Sterling's article, published the morning after Richard's arrest, detailed the systematic embezzlement with forensic precision that left no doubt about the scope of his crimes. But vindication came with consequences Emma hadn't anticipated. Marcus Thompson, despite being cleared of wrongdoing, submitted his resignation that same week, explaining to Emma during a brief phone call that his children needed stability more than he needed professional redemption. "I can't risk them becoming targets in whatever comes next," he said with weary resignation. David Kim faced his own reckoning when corporate communications became a liability rather than an asset. Despite his crucial role in exposing Richard's crimes, his association with the scandal made him unemployable at other major corporations. "Whistleblowers are heroes in movies," he told Emma bitterly, "but in real life, they're liabilities that other companies won't touch." The board meeting, that should have felt like triumph, instead revealed the hollow nature of revenge achieved through destruction. When Elena Vasquez formally offered Emma the position of CEO, the ultimate vindication of her campaign, Emma found herself hesitating for reasons she couldn't immediately articulate. "You've earned this," Elena said during their private conversation. Afterward, "You exposed the corruption, saved the company, demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership Meridian needs." But Emma stared out the 42nd floor windows at the Manhattan skyline and wondered whether accepting Richard's position would complete her transformation into the very type of executive she'd once opposed, someone who pursued power through any means necessary, regardless of collateral damage. Sophia Blackwood's situation was perhaps the most complex. Despite her cooperation with federal authorities, her association with Richard's crimes made her unemployable in corporate America. "I'm 23 years old," she told Emma during an unexpected phone call, "and my last name is now synonymous with corporate fraud. What exactly am I supposed to do with the rest of my life?" The question haunted Emma because she didn't have an answer. Justice had been served, crimes had been exposed, but the aftermath affected innocent people as much as the guilty. 3 weeks after Richard's arrest, Emma sat in her apartment reviewing job offers from competitors who viewed her as either a hero or a liability, depending on their perspective. The vindication she'd sought felt incomplete, tainted by the recognition that her methods had caused as much destruction as Richard's crimes. James Morrison called that evening with an update that confirmed her growing discomfort with what they'd accomplished. "Richard's criminal associates have disappeared entirely, no arrests, no investigation, no consequences for the people who were actually threatening families. We removed one corrupt CEO and replaced him with a power vacuum that solved nothing." Emma realized that her quest for justice had been both successful and inadequate. Richard would face federal prison, Meridian would survive with new leadership, but the systemic problems that enabled corruption, the networks of influence, the willingness to look the other way, the culture that prioritized results over methods, remained unchanged. Standing at her apartment window that night, looking up at the Meridian Industries building where her career had been built and destroyed, Emma faced the ultimate question about the price of justice: had her victory been worth the cost to everyone who'd helped her achieve it? Standing at her apartment window that night, looking up at the Meridian Industries building where her career had been built and destroyed, Emma faced the ultimate question about the price of justice: had her victory been worth the cost to everyone who'd helped her achieve it? Her answer would come in the choices she made over the following 6 months. Emma accepted the CEO position, but her first acts in the role defied every expectation. Instead of claiming the corner office that had been Richard's throne, she chose a smaller space on the 38th floor, closer to the operational teams that actually drove Meridian's business. Her inaugural address to the company focused not on her triumph over corruption, but on rebuilding trust and creating systems that would prevent future abuses. "Leadership isn't about power," she told the assembled employees, many of whom still regarded her with uncertainty. "It's about service to the people who make this company successful every day." Her first major decision was offering David Kim a senior vice president role in strategic development, not as reward for loyalty, but because his analytical skills and integrity made him perfect for designing new oversight systems. When he hesitated, concerned about his reputation as a whistleblower, Emma's response surprised him: "The fact that you were willing to risk everything for principle is exactly why this company needs you in leadership." Marcus Thompson's situation required more creative solutions. Emma approached him with an offer to become Meridian's chief ethics officer, a new position focused on developing company-wide integrity standards and training programs. Your children need to see that doing the right thing has positive consequences, she argued, and eventually convinced him to return. The most complex challenge was Sophia Blackwood. Despite her cooperation with federal authorities, no legitimate company would hire someone associated with corporate fraud. Emma's solution was both pragmatic and compassionate, offering Sophia an entry-level position in Meridian's compliance department, where she could rebuild her career based on merit rather than connections. You understand better than anyone how corruption starts, Emma explained. That makes you valuable for preventing it. But Emma's most important innovation was structural rather than personal. Working with Elena Vasquez, now board chair, she implemented radical transparency measures that would have been unthinkable under Richard's leadership. All executive compensation was published quarterly, vendor relationships required public justification, and financial decisions above certain thresholds required board approval regardless of CEO authority. The changes weren't universally popular. Several senior executives resigned rather than accept reduced autonomy, and some board members grumbled about micromanagement. But Emma's response was consistent: if transparency makes your job harder, you're probably doing your job wrong. Catherine Sterling's follow-up articles documented Meridian's transformation into what business schools would later study as a case example of post-crisis corporate reform. But the journalist's most insightful observation came during a private conversation with Emma 6 months after Richard's sentencing. "You've become everything you originally fought against," Catherine said during their lunch meeting, "and somehow that's exactly what this company needed." Emma considered the comment carefully. She had indeed become ruthless in pursuing efficiency, uncompromising in demanding accountability, and willing to sacrifice personal relationships for institutional integrity. But the difference, she realized, was that her ruthlessness served principles rather than personal gain. "Power doesn't corrupt," Emma replied finally. "It reveals." Richard's corruption was always there, power just gave him opportunities to express it. The question is whether power can reveal integrity as clearly as it reveals corruption. The test of that philosophy came when Meridian faced its first major crisis under Emma's leadership, a competitor's hostile takeover attempt. That would have resulted in massive layoffs and dismantling of the ethical systems Emma had built. The old Emma might have fought the takeover through any means necessary. The new Emma chose a different path. Instead of responding with corporate warfare, she opened the company's books completely, invited the acquiring company to examine Meridian's operations in detail, and made a counterproposal. Rather than a hostile takeover, why not a merger of equals that preserved both companies' cultures and employee bases? The transparency that might have made Meridian vulnerable instead demonstrated its strength. The acquiring company's board, impressed by Meridian's operational integrity and cultural transformation, agreed to the merger on terms that preserved everything Emma had built. Standing in the same conference room where Richard had fired her 18 months earlier, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her full circle. The merger would make her CEO of a combined entity worth $2 billion, but the title felt less important than the knowledge that she'd proven ethical leadership could be more effective than corruption. "Any regrets?" Elena asked after the merger announcement, as they watched news crews gathering in the lobby 42 floors below. Emma considered the question seriously. Marcus Thompson's children were proud of their father's integrity. David Kim had found purpose in building systems that protected honest employees. Sophia Blackwood was earning respect through merit rather than nepotism. Even Catherine Sterling had won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigation into corporate corruption. "I regret that it took Richard's betrayal to teach me what leadership really means," Emma said finally. "But I don't regret the fight." As the Manhattan sunset painted the glass towers in shades of gold and crimson, Emma understood that her quest for justice had succeeded not because she'd destroyed her enemy, but because she'd transformed herself. The woman who'd been fired for threatening corruption had become a leader who prevented it. The real victory wasn't revenge achieved, but principles maintained while wielding the very power that had corrupted her predecessor. In learning to balance justice with mercy, accountability with compassion, Emma had discovered that true leadership meant being willing to become the person your values required, regardless of the personal cost. The corporate coup was complete, but its greatest triumph was the leader it had created rather than the enemy it had defeated. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.